The courtroom was packed to the walls, a tension hanging in the air so heavy it almost suffocated the room. Cameras buzzed, reporters scribbled, and millions tuned in live across the country, waiting to see how this showdown would unfold. Trump, visibly restless, adjusted his tie, his face caught between defiance and unease. Denzel, calm but razor-sharp, leaned forward, his voice slicing through the silence like a blade. "Enough of the myths, enough of the golden pedestal," he declared. "This isn't about business genius or self-made triumph. This is about privilege, bought, inherited, and shielded by power." The words struck like thunder. A murmur rippled through the audience, some gasping, others clapping before the judge's gavel slammed to restore order. Trump's eyes narrowed, his fists clenching on the desk. "You don't know my story," he snapped, but his tone carried less fire than usual. Denzel didn't flinch. He raised documents, archived records, old testimonies, whispers of deals made behind closed doors, evidence pointing to a family empire built on connections and favors rather than grit. "You sold America the image of a fighter," Denzel continued, his voice steady, "but the truth is you were handed the fight already won." The confrontation wasn't just two men clashing, it was a symbol of something larger. For the millions watching, it became a question of honesty versus illusion, power versus accountability. Online, hashtags erupted within minutes, hashtag no more secrets, hashtag Denzel versus Trump, hashtag truth on trial. It was more than a courtroom, it was a stage where America's conscience was on trial. And for the first time, Trump looked cornered, not by political rivals or prosecutors, but by a voice that carried the weight of truth itself. As the judge's gavel echoed, the courtroom seemed to freeze in time. Every eye was locked on the two men, one a former president who had built his image on bravado, the other an actor-turned-voice of moral authority who now spoke like a prosecutor for the people. Trump leaned back, visibly rattled, his face flushed as if the walls themselves were pressing in on him. His supporters in the gallery shouted, "Witch hunt," while others hissed back, "Tell the truth." The chaos mirrored the country itself, divided, angry, and desperate for answers. Denzel stood firm, his presence commanding silence without even raising his voice. He read aloud from a stack of documents, each line cutting deeper, loans disguised as gifts, tax shelters hidden in plain sight, and the kind of generational wealth that had given Trump an empire before he ever entered a boardroom. "This isn't about success," Denzel said, his words crisp and deliberate, "this is about inheritance turned into arrogance. And America deserves to know the difference." Trump slammed his hand on the table, his booming voice filling the chamber. "I built everything. Nobody gave me anything," he barked, his words echoing like a last line of defense. But the silence that followed was heavier than his denial. Reporters captured every flicker of panic, every bead of sweat rolling down his temple. The cameras panned to the audience, ordinary citizens, veterans, single mothers, students, faces hardened with skepticism. They weren't convinced. Online, the storm grew. Hashtags weren't just trending, they were exploding. Memes showed Denzel's calm glare beside Trump's clenched jaw. Commentators called it the turning point of the century. Even political pundits who had defended Trump before were forced to confront the narrative shifting in real time. For many, Denzel's words had torn down a carefully crafted myth, one that had been sold for decades. The truth wasn't just spoken, it was televised, dissected, and burned into the national memory. The air inside the courtroom was electric, as though history itself had pulled up a chair to watch. Trump, visibly agitated, began pacing behind the defense table, pointing a finger at Denzel as if sheer intimidation could undo the damage. "You're an actor. You read scripts. This is my life," he shouted, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and desperation. Yet the more he barked, the smaller he seemed, his towering persona shrinking under the relentless spotlight. Denzel didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned forward, his tone sharpened with the weight of truth. "This isn't about theater," he declared, his gaze cutting through the noise. "This is about a man who inherited privilege and turned it into a weapon, while working families struggled to survive. You didn't earn America. You exploited it. His words echoed off the marble walls, drawing a hush so deep that even the shuffling of papers seemed deafening. Cameras zoomed in on Trump's face, his lips trembling, his usual bravado cracking like glass under pressure. The once confident figure who had built an empire on bravado now looked cornered, exposed, and oddly fragile. The courtroom spectators leaned in, whispering among themselves, as though they were watching the fall of a myth in real time. One journalist typed furiously, "Denzel dismantles decades of spin in under an hour." Outside the courthouse, the crowd roared as updates flooded social media. Chants of "No more secrets" thundered through the streets, mixing with car horns and drumbeats. The entire nation was watching live feeds, sharing clips, stitching together threads of Trump's contradictions against Denzel's unflinching delivery. It was more than a trial, it was a reckoning. What struck hardest wasn't just Denzel's evidence, but his composure. He wasn't screaming, he wasn't posturing, he was surgical, exposing privilege with the precision of a scalpel. Trump's attempts to fight back came off as hollow, his once powerful catchphrases reduced to empty slogans. The illusion of invincibility, built over decades, crumbled before millions of witnesses. In that moment, many realized the trial wasn't just about one man's past. It was about America's future. The myth of the self-made leader had collided head-on with reality, and the truth, harsh, undeniable, and televised, was winning. The pressure inside the courtroom reached a boiling point. Trump slammed his hand against the table, his voice rising in a desperate plea to reclaim control. "This is a witch hunt. You people are trying to erase my legacy, to destroy everything I've built." His words echoed, but the usual applause from his loyalists was absent. The silence was heavy, suffocating, broken only by the scratching pens of reporters capturing every tremor of his downfall. Denzel rose slowly, deliberate in his movements, like a man carrying centuries of struggle on his shoulders. The audience leaned forward, sensing something seismic was about to unfold. He turned, not just toward Trump, but to the jury, the cameras, the entire nation watching beyond those walls. His voice steadied, calm yet charged with unshakable conviction. "You speak of legacy," he began, his eyes locked on Trump, "but what you built wasn't opportunity, it was a fortress of lies. While families worked 2 jobs to keep the lights on, you hoarded wealth and power like birthright. And when cornered, you hide behind victimhood, as if accountability is persecution." The words hit harder than any gavel could. Trump's jaw clenched, his hands shook slightly as he tried to mask the tremor with forced bravado. But the mask was cracking in real time. Clips of the exchange were already dominating every news feed, split screens showing Trump's red, contorted face against Denzel's composed, unflinching gaze. Hashtags like #TruthOnTrial and #NoMoreSecrets trended worldwide. Gasps rippled through the crowd when Denzel delivered the line that pierced through decades of political theater: "America doesn't belong to kings. It belongs to the people who sweat, who sacrifice, who rise without privilege. You don't get to rewrite that truth with money or fear." The courtroom erupted, not in chaos, but in a stunned silence, the kind that signaled everyone knew they had just witnessed something historic. Social media exploded. Analysts called it the moment that stripped Trump bare. Commentators debated whether Denzel had not only won the room but reshaped the narrative of accountability in America. Outside, protesters and supporters clashed, but inside, the balance of power had shifted. Trump, who once thrived on dominating the stage, now looked like a man standing on the edge of collapse, cornered not by politics, but by truth itself. The courtroom was now a battlefield of history, privilege, and raw truth. Denzel leaned back for a moment, letting the silence draw tight like a bowstring. He wasn't finished, not by a long shot. "You see, Donald," he said, voice low but sharp enough to slice through the air, "America was built by sweat, by sacrifice, by people who didn't have a silver spoon carved out of empire wealth. While your grandfather was chasing schemes and your father was evicting families, my people were bleeding in fields, building the very foundations this country still stands on. The audience reacted with a murmur, the kind that carried weight, like thunder before a storm. Trump's jaw twitched, his knuckles widening on the polished wood of the defense table. He wanted to lash back, but every word would be another misstep on the trap Denzel had laid. The judge's gavel struck once, not to silence Denzel, but to remind everyone the chamber was still under law's domain. Yet it didn't matter, the room belonged to Denzel now. You call yourself self-made, but your story is nothing but an inheritance dressed up as grit, he continued. His voice grew louder, echoing off the marble walls. Real America doesn't respect crowns passed down through family privilege. Real America respects those who rise without a hand feeding them from birth. The jury shifted, their faces unreadable, but their eyes locked on Trump with a newfound scrutiny. This wasn't just about politics anymore. It was about truth cutting through myth, and Denzel was holding the blade steady. Trump finally snapped, his fist slamming against the table with a thud that reverberated through the chamber. Enough of this grandstanding, he barked, his face flushed red with fury. I built my empire. I fought for my place. Nobody handed me anything. His voice cracked at the edges, betraying the desperation beneath his rage. But Denzel didn't even flinch, he simply leaned forward, locking eyes with him as though the two men were the only ones in the room. You fought? Denzel asked, his tone dripping with disbelief. You fought banks that bent the rules for you? You fought contractors who you left unpaid? You fought against the very workers who laid the bricks while you signed checks with money you never earned? That's not a fight, Donald. That's exploitation with a gold-plated pen. Gasps filled the courtroom as reporters scribbled furiously, cameras clicking in rapid bursts to capture every twist of Trump's contorted expression. He tried to interrupt, but Denzel's words came like a tide, unstoppable and merciless. America's children grow up learning they have to claw their way through the mud, pray they get a chance. But you, Denzel jabbed a finger toward him, his voice rising into a roar, you were born on the mountaintop, and you still pretend you climbed it. The crowd erupted, some with applause, others with stunned silence, but all eyes locked on Trump, who looked cornered, his defenses shrinking with every breath. The trial no longer felt like law, it felt like judgment, and Denzel had become the voice of a restless nation. Trump pushed himself back in his chair, his hand trembling as it reached for a glass of water. The weight of the accusations pressed on him heavier than the gavel resting on the judge's desk. You don't understand what it takes, he muttered, his voice quieter now, almost pleading. You don't know the sacrifices, the pressure, the enemies I've faced. His words felt thinner than paper, drifting into the silence of a room no longer buying the performance. Denzel rose slowly, deliberately, his presence commanding every corner of the chamber. He didn't shout, he didn't have to. His voice carried the force of a storm held within. Sacrifice? Denzel said, his tone sharp enough to cut steel. You speak of sacrifice while millions work double shifts just to feed their families. You speak of enemies while entire communities carried the burden of policies that left them abandoned. You speak of pressure while you lounged in towers built by men whose names you never cared to learn. His eyes bore into Trump's, unwavering, piercing, relentless. Sacrifice is a mother choosing between rent and medicine. Sacrifice is a father leaving home before dawn and returning long after dark, hands blistered, dignity worn down. Don't you dare steal that word from them. The spectators leaned in, the room vibrating with tension, as if history itself held its breath. The camera zoomed in on Trump, sweat beading across his forehead, his once unshakable swagger reduced to a flicker of doubt. Every sentence from Denzel seemed less like an attack and more like a mirror, forcing Trump to confront a truth he had long evaded. For the first time, the man who thrived on spectacle was the spectacle himself, and there was no escape. The courtroom was electric now, a storm contained within four walls. Trump shifted in his seat, gripping the edge of the table as though it might anchor him against the tidal wave of truth washing over him. He tried to muster his old bravado, puffing his chest, but his voice cracked under the strain. You think you're the voice of the people, Denzel? You think Hollywood makes you their savior? His words stumbled out like broken glass, sharp but fragile, leaving cuts without conviction. Denzel didn't smile, didn't sneer, he stood firm, a man carrying the collective weight of those whose voices had been drowned out. I'm not a savior, he said, his tone calm but thunderous in its clarity. I'm a witness. A witness to what greed does when it's dressed up as leadership. A witness to the pain caused by arrogance passed off as strength. And right now, this courtroom, this nation, is witnessing you, stripped of the illusions, laid bare for what you are. Gasps rippled through the gallery, murmurs spreading like wildfire as Denzel's words struck harder than any gavel. Journalists exchanged wide-eyed glances, their pens racing across notepads, knowing headlines were writing themselves in real time. Trump tried to speak again, but the words caught in his throat, silenced not by force but by the undeniable reality pressing down on him. For years he had thrived in arenas of spectacle, where volume drowned truth, but here, in this chamber, truth had a voice louder than his own. The judge's gavel struck once, not to restore order but to mark the moment, as if to acknowledge history being etched into the walls. The tension wasn't just political, it was personal, generational, moral. And in that silence after the echo faded, one thing was clear, the people weren't just watching, they were awakening. Trump's mask of defiance began to crack like glass under pressure. His eyes darted around the room, searching for allies, for an escape, for anything to break the intensity of the moment. But the room offered him nothing, no applause, no chants, no cheering crowd. Only silence, heavy and suffocating, punctuated by the rhythmic clicks of cameras capturing his unraveling. He finally leaned forward, his voice hoarse, "You don't know what it's like to have the world against you." Denzel took a slow step closer, his presence a towering shadow of calm fire. "The world against you," he repeated, each word deliberate. "Donald, the world wasn't against you, it was bent for you. Every rule, every break, every backroom deal, it was all tilted in your favor. And still, you cry persecution while real people suffer under systems you manipulated." His voice rose, not in anger, but in righteous conviction that shook the walls more than any outburst could. The gallery erupted, not in chaos, but in a roar of applause that drowned out Trump's trembling protest. People rose to their feet, some with tears streaking their cheeks, others with clenched fists raised high. The judge banged the gavel furiously, but the sound was lost beneath the tide of voices crying out, voices that had waited years to see a man of power finally confronted without fear. Trump's shoulders slumped, his bravado crumbling like sand in the wind. He muttered something inaudible, his eyes falling to the table as though the wood itself could shield him from the piercing gaze of both Denzel and the nation. For the first time, the man who once commanded rallies, who thrived on domination, sat diminished, cornered not by politics, but by truth. And the people, tasting this moment like oxygen after suffocation, knew it was bigger than the trial, it was a reckoning. The courtroom had transformed into something far greater than a legal battleground. It was now a stage where the weight of history pressed down on every witness, every word, every silence. Trump sat hunched, the fire in his eyes reduced to a flicker, his hands gripping the table as though it might hold him together. The air was heavy, yet electric, every breath felt like the pause before thunder. Denzel stood tall, his presence calm yet commanding, the kind of authority that didn't come from office or wealth but from truth carried in his chest. He let the silence stretch, letting Trump stew in it, letting America lean in. And then he spoke, his voice low but resonant, the kind of voice that etched itself into memory. Power without conscience is not leadership, it's tyranny. And tyranny has no place in a nation built on sacrifice, struggle, and hope. A wave rippled through the gallery, people nodding, some weeping quietly, others pressing hands to their hearts. Reporters captured the words like they were scripture, each sentence destined for headlines, for history books. Trump tried to speak, his lips parted, a hand lifted, but no sound came. It wasn't that he had no words. It was that no words could defend him now. Denzel leaned forward one last time, his eyes locked on Trump's. You called yourself the voice of America. But America has spoken, and it doesn't echo your lies. It speaks through truth, through courage, through justice. And today, it speaks through me. The room erupted, applause thundered like a storm breaking, chants rose from the gallery, and for the first time in years, the narrative did not belong to Trump. The gavel came down, sharp and final, sealing the moment not as just another trial, but as a reckoning that would echo for generations. And as Trump sat there, diminished and exposed, Denzel's words lingered in the air like fire. A reminder that no empire of deception could outlast the truth. This wasn't just an argument, it was a confrontation that struck at the very heart of America. Denzel's words proved once again that power without responsibility is nothing but decay. Remember this moment, because history isn't only written in laws, it's written in courage.